Can we talk a little bit about like hibiscus and some of those like neck bones, where those were originated and how they got into soul food as well?
Yeah, so the hibiscus is native to West Africa, and actually makes its way to the this side of the world through the Atlantic slave trade. So in West Africa, depending on where you are, it goes by different names. And essentially, it was a hospitality drink. So what you would do is somebody would come over, you get some water, you take the flower petals of the hibiscus plant, with a nice crimson kind of cranberry red, put them in the water, turn it a nice red color, cranberry color, and then sweeten it to taste.
Okay.
So that drink comes over in Jamaica. It's called sorrel, and it was a Christmas time drink for a long time because that's when the flower bloomed. But now people drink it year round, and it makes its way around the Caribbean and even to Latin America, where it's called agua de Jamaica, so Jamaica water. So you can go to a taqueria and order agua de Jamaica, and you're drinking a riff off of West Africa. And so I think it's the hibiscus drink as well as cola nut teas, because there are red cola nuts also native to West Africa. I think that's where we get our love of red drink. And I think Kool-Aid is just a riff on all of these traditional red drinks. So that's an important thing that shows up in soul food canon. Okra is native to Africa. It's actually from East Africa, but makes its way throughout the continent. It's a signature of West African cuisine as a thickener. I love okra in so many ways. I used to not like okra because of the sliminess, but
Yep.
man, I just love okra now. I love it in all its forms. I'll have it whole, fresh. If you get the small okra fresh and just eat it, that's amazing. Or you can have it whole, boiled, like sliced, boiled. I even like it charred.
See.
And also, now a lot of people like it fried, so it's kind of like bar food now. And then neck bones and other things, they're called variety meats. And so these were the cuts of meat that Black people often had to use because of their status in society. They weren't given access to the prestigious cuts of meat like the ham, the pork shoulder, all these other things. So they often had to use these other cuts of meat to season their food. And so that becomes a staple or signature of soul food cuisine as well. And it leads into this idea that we took the scraps and made them delicious. That I understand why that story persists. It's part of the soul food story, but it's not the whole story. So I really want to emphasize that.
No, that's a great point. And then to even to your talking about okra, I remember just growing up and my aunt swore by okra. It was always the fried okra too. So I never would, I always liked it. It was one of those things that like, if you had it, it was something you ate, but it wasn't like my go-to. But I love that it's a part of soul food. And I appreciate you breaking down the traditions of it. And you're talking a little bit about Jamaica. So I do want to shift a little bit into Caribbean foods because I think, again, when we're talking about soul food, Caribbeans have their go-to staples when we think about things like oxtail and we think about the difference between Jamaican curry and Indian curry. Can you just talk about where some of those traditions were, how they started in Caribbean foods?
Sure, but one thing I forgot to mention is okra in several West African languages. Okra is similar to the word gumbo.
Okay.
And so when you went, so that's almost like synonymous. So the idea that this okra vegetable is thickening soups and stews, you can see how gumbo is a reinterpreted
That
kind
makes
of West
sense.
African stew. So I just wanted to make sure I forgot to mention that. So yeah, you know what? One of the things, Kyle, that has really surprised me is that there should be a much stronger influence from the Caribbean on soul food, but you just don't see it show up.
Hmm.
Given the history and the proximity, because we know that a lot of enslaved people went from Africa to the Caribbean first before coming to what would later be called the United States. But you just don't see that spicing and technique show up in soul food, and I'm not sure why. I have some thoughts. Looking back through newspapers in the 1920s and other things, there was animosity between native-born U.S. blacks and Caribbean immigrants,
Gotcha.
and so there may have been an active distancing from that food for whatever reason. Now, when you're in places with a high Caribbean population, you will see soul food joints that have kind of Caribbean and soul food on the menu. And the distinctions and tensions are much less now than they were 100 years ago. But man, you just don't see a lot of Caribbean flavor profiles and techniques show up in soul food. And I just think it should be there. But to your point, very similar cooking, right? Emphasis on dark leafy greens. Kalaloo is a popular dish throughout the Caribbean, and it's basically a greens kind of stew. You talked about the use of variety meats, so the neck bones. I believe Jamaicans make the neck bones the best, or I'm sorry, oxtails,
Okay.
the
Yep.
best. Man, just the gravy they create it's just amazing.
I agree.
Yeah. You've got the jerk seasoning with the Caribbean, with Jamaica. Although personally, I don't think jerk is a type of barbecue. I know that people think that, but I just don't think that. I've talked to some native Jamaicans that it's really a seasoning technique, and then the just the bountiful use of fruits and vegetables. And then when you get to the dessert side, you see things like what we would call sweet potato pudding show up in the Caribbean, usually with some coconut involved, but other coconut based desserts. And I forgot, mac and cheese is big in the Caribbean as well.
Not as good.
So
Not as good
yeah,
though.
yeah. So you see a lot of commonality, but the for whatever reason, the Caribbean influence on soul food just never really took.
No, that's a good point. I was gonna say, yeah, with Jamaican, at least when I've had Jamaican mac and cheese, it hasn't been as always as good as some of the Southern style and stuff in America. But that's for another topic. Can you talk about something? Because you were talking about this diaspora, West Africa, and the foods that are kind of coming through. And one of the things I really enjoyed from one of your conversations, you said like soul food is not slave food. Can you break that down for us and why people just assume that a lot of soul food is slave food?
Yeah, and I think it comes out of that narrative that enslaved African American cooks took the scraps and made them delicious. So one of the big part of this soul food framing of soul food just has to deal with this belief that Black people only ate the stuff that white people did not want. And when I started delving into this history, what I found out is soul food is really a bringing together of West Africa, the Americas, and Europe. And so you see the precursors to a lot of dishes showing up in the cuisines in those other places, and then you see how it comes to the American South and it gets transformed into something a little bit different but similar to these other things. So that's the process that's going on. But when you look at what enslaved African Americans were really eating, they were gardening, foraging, fishing, hunting, in addition to the rations that they got from the enslaver, and the weekly rations were usually 5 pounds of some meat, smoked, salted, dried, pickled, usually pork, a couple of pounds of some starch, usually cornmeal, but it could be sweet potatoes or rice, and then a jug of molasses. And so, learning from Native Americans and from others, seeing what Europeans were doing and all these other sources, they started to create a cuisine that would later be known as soul food. So I tell people that the slave food aspect of it is just one part. Typically on these plantations, if you're on a small plantation, enslaver and enslaved were eating out of the same pot because it didn't make sense to have a separate cook. On the larger plantations, typically food was controlled and cooked during the week. But then when you got to the weekend, enslaved people had more latitude to create other things. And so we see a lot going on. I just think it's a much more complex story than just to limit it to this. Like, and the other thing is what we find out is that when you look at what people ate in the South, it's more about class and place than it is about race. Meaning, white people and black people of the same socioeconomic status in an area were often eating very similar food. Now, because of racism, they weren't eating together, but the diet was pretty similar.
If you enjoyed that clip, make sure you head over to www.bookupapp.com to download our app so you can connect with your favorite bookish content creators, start conversations, and start your own book club.